Well, the White House press briefing room is now a waiting room for a plane that's never going to take off. The new White House press secretary has not set foot in the White House press briefing room. One of Donald Trump's White House press secretaries never set foot in the White House press briefing room in the last Trump presidency. That last Trump White House went over 300 days without a press briefing. 300 days. And then 4 years ago, this is what happened in the White House press briefing room on Inauguration Day.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this historic day. It's an honor to be here with all of you. When the president asked me to serve in this role, we talked about the importance of bringing truth and transparency back to the briefing room. And he asked me to ensure we are communicating about the policies across the Biden-Harris administration and the work his team is doing every single day on behalf of all American people. There will be times when we see things differently in this room, among all of us. That's okay. That's part of our democracy.
The Trump White House doesn't think so. They don't think that's part of our democracy. They don't care about what Jen Psaki just called our democracy. Every day, Jen Psaki walked into that briefing room, every day, for 2 years, and took all of their questions and handled those questions masterfully, better than any White House press secretary of the television era. Then Karine Jean-Pierre took over the briefings every day for 2 years. The White House press corps became as openly hostile to Karine Jean-Pierre as they have ever been to a White House press secretary, including the famously beleaguered Ron Ziegler of the Nixon White House, who had the impossible press secretary job of trying to defend a criminal president. The White House press corps attacked Karine Jean-Pierre more than they ever attacked Ron Ziegler, because although there are some able and honorable reporters in that room, as a group, they have absolutely no sense of balance whatsoever. And as of tonight, there is no White House briefing even scheduled, none. And there is not a single complaint from the White House press corps. They could turn on their cameras and scream at the empty podium and televise that to show their outrage at not being allowed to ask a single question of the White House press secretary, but they would never dare do that in the Trump White House. We all know that life isn't fair, and Washington certainly isn't fair, and the White House press corps, for this first week at least, personifies just how unfair Washington can be. We should not pass from the Biden White House to the Trump White House without noting the grotesque double standard that the Washington press corps has applied to Joe Biden and Donald Trump, entirely to Donald Trump's benefit. It's not just Republican members of the House and Republican members of the Senate who know better, who have accommodated themselves to Donald Trump. We all know that Republicans in Congress who know better, who have accommodated themselves to Donald Trump, do that completely out of fear, the fear of losing their re-elections to a Trump-favored candidate. Bravery is not a typical characteristic of politicians, so there's no surprise in politicians, Republican politicians' fear of Donald Trump. And it doesn't take bravery for a reporter to scream at Karine Jean-Pierre in a White House press briefing. And it didn't take bravery for reporters to scream at Joe Biden in the Oval Office, as they did, or in the Roosevelt Room, as they did. But it would take bravery for them to scream at Donald Trump or at the White House press secretary working for Donald Trump if she ever shows up in that briefing room in, say, the next 300 days. Don't be surprised if you don't hear reporters screaming in the White House for at least another 4 years, because Washington is now operating under the Trump standard. And it is not just Republican politicians who are operating under the Trump standard. The day after Donald Trump legally forgave, through commutations or pardons, all of the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, including every single violent criminal who was convicted of physically beating and attacking police officers, even some Senate Republicans couldn't justify Donald Trump's decision.
People who committed violent crimes on January 6th of 2021 should not be pardoned. And I think this is a terrible day for our Justice Department.
It's wrong to assault anybody, but certainly to assault an officer. And I'm a big back to blue guy.
I'm disappointed to see that, and I do hear the message that is sent to these great men and women that stood by us.
Glad those words are on the screen because I couldn't hear Senator Murkowski. There was nothing wrong with your TV set. So here we are. It's the Trump standard. Most Republican senators, most Republicans, members of the House of Representatives, are desperately afraid of criticizing Donald Trump for pardoning people who beat police officers, who tried to kill police officers and said they wanted to kill Mike Pence. The Trump standard changes that for Republican members of Congress, except for those few voices that you just heard. The Department of Justice had to send victim notifications to the police officers who those Trump rioters assaulted and beat and threatened to murder and tried to murder. They actively tried to murder them. Those police officers got victim notifications, as is required by law, saying that the people who attacked them by name, telling them who they were, will be released and have been released back into the community without any court supervision whatsoever. Sergeant Aquilino Gonell received this message this morning, informing him of the release of Frederico Klein, a former Trump appointee to the State Department, actually, who received a nearly 6-year sentence for assaulting police officers and other crimes. Quote, advance notice of this release was not possible since this release was immediate and/or unexpected. Upon release, the inmate will reside in Annandale, Virginia, but is not subject to community supervision following release. Prosecutors said that Klein, quote, joined the large mob fighting against the police on the West Plaza. While there, he shoved police officers who were trying to control the crowd and protect the building. During that assault, Klein called out, "You can't stop this." He also called to rioters behind him for help in pushing against the police. Klein was convicted of 8 felonies, including 6 assaults, civil disorder, and obstruction of an official proceeding, and 4 misdemeanors. Because most of the January 6th convicts have served their time already, actually only 211 of the Trump insurrectionists were released by the Bureau of Prisons within the 12 hours of the Donald Trump order. They're now able to stand back and stand by, as Donald Trump might want them to do, ready to engage for Donald Trump in any way he might call upon them to do in the future. Because most of the January 6th convicts have served their time, the entire process of those individuals under the Bureau of Prisons custody took approximately 12 hours and resulted in the release of 211 individuals. In several of these cases, family members and partners helped bring rioters to justice, informed on them in some cases, including leaders and members of extremist groups like the Oath Keepers and the 3 Percenters. And these family members are now afraid for their lives. In an interview with USA Today in October, the ex-wife and son of the so-called Oath Keepers leader, Elmer Stuart Rhodes, expressed fear that they are on a kill list. On this program in October, Jackson Reffitt explained why he reported his father, Guy Reffitt, to the FBI, and that his father brought his guns to Washington on January 6th. Jackson Reffitt told us how he would feel last night if Donald Trump were to free his father. What will it mean to you if all of the January 6th prisoners are released on Inauguration Day?
It means I'm always going to be in danger. Trump has said that one of the biggest targets is the enemy within. And I'm sure from a lot of perspectives, such as Trump's, I'm one of those examples. So if my father and everyone involved in January 6th is released, I don't know what else to think other than fear.
His father threatened to kill him before he knew that his son turned him into the FBI. Now that Donald Trump has freed them all without supervision, every single prison sentence from the longest term of 22 years for Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio for seditious conspiracy to those with short jail sentences for misdemeanors, they've all been erased. The rioters assaulted more than 140 police officers with chemical spray, tasers, bike racks, stolen riot shields, a fire extinguisher, flagpoles, and other weapons. Some arrived to Washington that day with their guns, and former Capitol Police Officer Michael Fanone testified to Congress that other rioters threatened to shoot him with his own gun. Michael Fanone suffered a heart attack and traumatic brain injury from that attack. In the body cam footage of that assault, Officer Fanone can be heard desperately trying to stop them from killing him by telling them that he is a father.
John Bolton, you remember him, mustache guy, Donald Trump's former national security advisor. He's had a Secret Service detail protecting him for years, and that's not something national security advisors usually get. But he's had one because somebody tried to hire a hitman to kill him. That someone allegedly was the nation of Iran. DOJ charged a member of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard with a murder-for-hire plot against John Bolton. And because of that, President Biden arranged for Bolton to have a Secret Service detail starting in 2021. And it's not just John Bolton who has faced that kind of threat, specifically from Iran. This is interesting. There's interesting reporting that some of the last warnings the outgoing Biden Homeland Security team gave to the incoming Trump team before the inauguration, some of their last warnings were about Iranian threats to kill current and former U.S. government officials. So that was the last thing Biden's folks told Trump's folks before they walked out the door. And then one of the first things Trump did when he walked in the door is he canceled John Bolton's Secret Service protection. John Bolton responded today in part, quote, "I'm disappointed but not surprised that President Trump has decided to terminate the protection previously provided by the U.S. Secret Service. Notwithstanding my criticisms of President Biden's national security policies, he nonetheless made the decision to extend that protection to me in 2021. Bolton says the threat to him from Iran remains, and, quote, "The American people can judge for themselves which president made the right call." I should also mention that Trump also revoked John Bolton's security clearance, as well as security clearances from a few dozen other former officials that Trump is mad at for various reasons. But you know who Trump is giving security clearances to? Really high-level security clearances to? Anybody. Anybody who wants one. Step right up, no background check needed. Trump signed an executive order yesterday saying the White House will immediately grant the highest level of security clearance to personnel of the White House's choosing, whether or not those people have been vetted at all. Look under your seat. You get a security clearance. Speaking of security clearances, Tulsi Gabbard still doesn't have a date for her confirmation hearing to be Trump's director of national intelligence. It's still amazing to say. Senate Republicans have blamed a paperwork problem. Okay, but there also continues to be stuff like this new hair-raising reporting from the Washington Post. Today's reporting on Gabbard casts doubt on her longtime explanation of a trip she took to Syria in 2017 as a congresswoman, a trip where she infamously met with the dictator Bashar al-Assad and then came back and refused to say that he was a bad guy for bombing and gassing his own civilians. Gabbard has also said it was a surprise. She didn't expect to meet Assad on that trip, but she said the opportunity arose once she was there and she just felt spur of the moment like she should take it. The Washington Post's review today of documents and interviews with her congressional staff from the time show that she met with Assad basically immediately when she got there. She met with him for about 3 hours, and then she met with him a second time. One of her staffers from the time telling the Post today, quote, "I will go to the grave believing that she lied to us." Her claim is that it just sort of happened. How do you just happen to meet with the leader of a police state, not once, but twice? A Trump transition spokeswoman calls the Post story a, quote, deep state smear campaign filled with gross misrepresentation and conjecture. But someday soon, Republican senators are going to have to decide if this is the right person who should be in charge of all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies. Joining us now is the journalist and author Tim Weiner. He's the author of the seminal history of the CIA, Legacy of Ashes. His next book is called The Mission, the CIA in the 21st Century. It's out later this year. I can't wait. Tim, it's nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Rachel.
What do you make of the choice of Tulsi Gabbard to be the nominee to be Director of National Intelligence?
With the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, Kash Patel for the FBI, Pete Hegseth for Defense, and John Radcliffe for CIA, what you are seeing is an element of Trump's desire to decapitate the national security establishment of the United States.
Decapitate it, meaning disable it?
By putting in empty heads in charge of it.
You've written so much about the structure and history of the CIA and also the FBI. Is the person at the top determinative in terms of not only the actions of the agency, but potentially the fates of these agencies and these functions?
Once when I was in Afghanistan, a Mujahideen said, we have an old saying in our country, the fish stinks from the head, which is a universal truth.
Yeah.
If you put in charge of the American national security establishment crackpots and fools whose only qualification is their deathless loyalty to Donald Trump, you are not going to get good intelligence. We are in a very dangerous moment in this world. We are approaching a state of total war in this world. We have the axis of autocracy lining up against the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Korean, lining up against Ukraine. You've got a moment where we have to have smoothly functioning intelligence. Intelligence is just $1 billion word for information. Mm-hmm. The president is supposed to know and care what's going on over the horizon. The intelligence agencies, when they work, are in charge of anticipating surprise, so you don't get a bolt from the blue, as we've seen in our lifetimes. You cannot run an intelligence service if you are putting the people in charge and the people beneath them through loyalty oaths and ideological purity tests. This is what's happening in that executive order after he strips the security clearances of 5 former directors and deputy directors of CIA, 3 of the guys who ran very nervy operations against the Russians, some of the best intelligence analysts of our lifetime. In the paragraph below, he says, the director of national intelligence and the CIA director shall go into the ranks and root out people who are politically suspect. If you do that, you are going to have people running for the exits rather than submit to purity tests. And that's a dangerous thing.
What is the danger of giving out security clearances at the highest level as party favors to anybody who asks for them at the White House without any vetting?
Well, if I were a foreign intelligence service allied with the United States, would I want to share secrets with Tulsi Gabbard or some 25-year-old whose qualification is he wears a MAGA hat? I would not. I would think it would make the world a more dangerous place.
Tim Weiner's latest book on the CIA will be out this summer. Book me all ready for that. Tim, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to the ReidOut. We have a lot to get to in the next hour. I'll talk to Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser, one of 23 attorneys general suing the Trump administration over its executive order attempting to ban birthright citizenship. Plus, there was this remarkable scene at a national prayer service in Washington today.
I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives.
That is the Episcopal Bishop of Washington urging Donald Trump to do something that isn't natural for him. Show mercy. But we begin tonight with the completion of the coup. Just over 4 years ago, Donald Trump, in a last-ditch effort to try to stay in power after losing the 2020 election, unleashed an army of his MAGA supporters on the U.S. Capitol. We all watched live and in horror as the violence ensued that day. More than 140 police officers were injured, and several Trump supporters died during the attack. While Trump's coup attempt failed that day, he never stopped attacking the courts, the integrity of the vote, and the rule of law, insisting that he stood above them all. Well, yesterday, in the same place in the Capitol where his supporters tried to overturn our democracy, Donald Trump celebrated his triumph in completing the coup 4 years later, and once again was sworn in as president. It was just a bizarre day from start to finish, frankly, with this remarkable scene from Elon Musk, where he made a very suggestive hand gesture.
And I just want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you.
Well, that moment has gone viral and even made it into the confirmation hearing this morning for Trump's pick for UN Ambassador Elise Stefanik.
What do you think of Elon Musk, perhaps the president's most visible advisor, doing 2 Heil Hitler salutes last night at the president's televised rally?
No, Elon Musk did not do those salutes. I was not at the rally, but I can tell you I've been at many rallies with Elon Musk, who loves to cheer when President Trump says we need to send, our U.S. space program to Mars. Elon Musk is a visionary.
That was about Mars. Trump's first day in office ended with a final step in the coup. He pardoned nearly all of the more than 1,500 insurrectionists charged in connection with the attack that he called for. 14 others had their sentences commuted, most of whom were convicted of seditious conspiracy. And that long list of pardons is not just people who were charged with trespassing or nonviolent crimes like this guy, Kevin Seafried, who you may remember for carrying a Confederate flag into the Capitol, something that didn't even happen during the Civil War. He was sentenced to 3 years and was the first rioter to interact with U.S. Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman, who heroically led the mob away from the Senate chamber. Also on the pardon list were some of the most violent insurrectionists, including the nearly 200 people charged with attacking police officers that day with flagpoles, tasers, batons, wooden planks, anything they could get their hands on. There's Jack Whitten, who received a nearly 5-year sentence for assaulting police officers using a metal crutch, for kicking an officer on the ground, and for dragging an officer into the mob. You have Peter Schwartz, who was serving a 14-year sentence for engaging in a series of assaults on police officers, including repeatedly using pepper spray on them and joining in on the mob that crushed out Officer Daniel Hodges in a Capitol doorway. And there is David Dempsey, who was serving 20 years for assault on law enforcement with a deadly or dangerous weapon. In his case, he was using a flagpole and police shield against the police. The get out of jail free cards also extended to those from extremist militia groups who helped plan the attack. Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the Proud Boys, who was serving a 22-year prison sentence for seditious conspiracy, pardoned. Elmer Stewart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, who was serving 18 years on the same charge, had his sentence commuted. No harm, no foul, right? Of course, I'm sure that these now pardoned insurrectionists are showing contrition for their actions, right? Oh, no. Mm-mm. You may remember Jacob Chansley, a.k.a. the QAnon shaman. His response to receiving a pardon and no longer being a felon was, quote, "I'm gonna buy me some mother effing guns." Feel safer yet? And what about those police officers who were on the receiving end of the attacks by the very people who Trump has called patriots and hostages?
He's been promising these presidential pardons for those that committed crimes on January 6th in participation with the attack on the Capitol. Ever since day one. And so the American people own this decision. You chose this, you elected this man as president, and now you are responsible for these pardons. These individuals and many more like them have been emboldened. Donald Trump announced to America a new era of government lawlessness, and that if you commit crimes on his behalf, you will not face accountability.
Michael Fanone spent the morning at a courthouse seeking protective orders against those who assaulted him. Former Sergeant Aquilino Gonell, who was nearly crushed to death at the hands of the mob, shared a screenshot of the numerous victim notifications he received from the Justice Department of all those who attacked him who had been released. Look, Trump has long been clear that he was going to pardon his MAGA insurrectionists. But even among Republicans, few believe that the man who claimed to be all about law and order and the best friend to law enforcement would go so far as to release those who so violently attacked the police. That included Republican leaders who are now silent, including Trump's new non-Mike Pence vice president, who claimed that this wouldn't happen.
Do you believe that someone who assaulted a law enforcement officer on January 6th deserves a pardon?
No, I think what the president said and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has said is that peaceful protesters should be pardoned, but violent criminals should not. That's a simple determination.
If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned.
Of course, if somebody was beating up a police officer at January 6th, he's not going to do that.
Joining me now is former Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn, who was assaulted by the now pardoned violent mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Also joining me, former Congressman David Jolly and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, MSNBC legal analyst and professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Harry Dunn, what do you make of the promises that Donald Trump would not pardon, according to his supporters on Capitol Hill, including his now vice president, and the fact that he did exactly that, pardoned some of the most violent insurrectionists from that day?
So thanks for having me on. Why are people surprised? Why are people surprised? People that are shocked by this outrageous, egregious act against this country, against these police officers. If you're shocked, then you haven't been paying attention. Donald Trump did exactly what he said he was going to do. He said it from day one. And anybody expecting anything different out of him, what is wrong? It's on us. It's on us. For 4 years, me and the other officers who testified before Congress, we haven't had our hands out. We haven't asked for anything except accountability. And it's gone. It's gone. Like, they were able to say easily that the foot soldiers had been arrested, and yeah, that was great. And I was like, yo, get everybody, even Donald Trump. That was my goal. That was my plea. That didn't happen. And now the foot soldiers aren't even responsible anymore. If there's no record, I mean, there's a record of it. Obviously, the record doesn't go away thanks to, the Supreme Court allowing the report, Jack Smith's report, to be released. But even that was in jeopardy. But why is anybody surprised, man? Like, you just haven't been paying attention. Donald Trump did exactly what he said he was going to do. And anybody that expect different, then that's on you.
Yeah. David Jolly, I just have to show the split screen, because yesterday when I was watching the inauguration, it really was chilling for me to see Donald Trump being applauded, including by some Democrats who, for whatever reason, felt the need to show up to this event, to stand around with billionaires. And it's the same exact space where these people were smearing feces, beating up police officers, crowding into the place, shoving police officers, in some cases really harming them, tasing them. It's the same space, David. It's sacrilege, it seems to me. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Joy, I think millions of Americans yesterday were unsettled by seeing Donald Trump inaugurated a second time, and unsettled by the reception he received, not just from Republicans, but as you mentioned, by Democrats trying to hold to the norms, that trying to make the inauguration feel familiar. It should not be familiar. Donald Trump is an oath breaker, and his words cannot be trusted. His promises cannot be trusted. His actions cannot be trusted. Donald Trump was a danger to the republic when he was president the first time. That's why he was charged with conspiracy to defraud the American people. We know what he did to instigate the violence on January 6th. Donald Trump was a threat to the republic when he was out of office. That's why he was charged with mishandling classified information. And he remains a threat to the republic now, once again as president, and in exercising the pardon authority, he demonstrated that. You went through the list of people who were charged for crimes for assaulting police officers. We also know the ideologies and the violent rhetoric of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and others. Joy, one of the people he pardoned just a few months back was arrested for trying to board a flight to Russia to fight for the Russian army against Ukraine. That is also somebody that Donald Trump gave a pardon to. And so where Donald Trump remains a threat, he unleashed a crowd of people that also remain a threat. Now, certainly, they'll put up the sympathetic case of the grandma who got caught going into the Capitol, whatever. I am sure there is penance and repentance among some of the J6ers, but not all of them.
We were expecting, based on your initial schedule, that today roundups of criminal illegal aliens in the process of deporting them would begin. That seems to have been put on hold for a little while. When can we expect that to happen? Where will it begin?
No, it started.
It has started.
ICE teams are out there as of today. We gave them the direction to prioritize public safety threats that we're looking for. Teams are out there effective today.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. The crackdown is underway. It has begun mere hours after Donald Trump was sworn into office. He signed an array of executive orders pushing forward his anti-immigration agenda, from declaring a national emergency at the southern border to halting refugee admissions into the country and much, much more, all amounting to what the New York Times describes this way. Quote, the leading edge of an effort to roll back 4 years of policies put in place by the Biden administration and reimpose an agenda that would fundamentally upend the United States' global role as a sanctuary for refugees and immigrants. But the crackdown came from the other side as well. Donald Trump's orders were immediately faced with legal challenges. The ACLU out last night with a lawsuit against Trump's order seeking to end birthright citizenship, a right guaranteed in the Constitution under the 14th Amendment. Anthony Romero, the ACLU's executive director, saying this, quote, denying citizenship to U.S.-born children is not only unconstitutional, it's also a reckless and ruthless repudiation of American values. Birthright citizenship is part of what makes the U.S. the strong and dynamic nation that it is. This order seeks to repeat one of the gravest errors in American history by creating a permanent subclass of people born in the U.S. who are denied full rights as Americans. We will not let this attack on newborns and future generations of Americans go unchallenged. The Trump administration's overreach is so egregious that we are confident we will ultimately prevail. That lawsuit was followed up today by another from the New York Attorney General and a coalition of 17 other states and the cities of D.C. and San Francisco, who said this, quote, our Constitution is not open to reinterpretation by executive order or presidential decree. President Trump's attempt to undermine the fundamental right to birthright citizenship is not just unconstitutional, it is profoundly dangerous. 4 more states filed their own suit this afternoon. Trump's additional orders giving the U.S. military a more specific role at the southern border and the one paving the way for him to use the Alien Enemies Act are also likely to face challenges in the courts. In the flurry of all these actions, Trump also took aim at his predecessor and rescinded the order President Biden signed just weeks into his own administration, which created a task force to reunite all the immigrant families who have been separated under Trump's family separation policy, including children. As our friend and colleague Jacob Soboroff reminds us, as many as 1,000 families and young children remain separated because of that policy. Donald Trump's massive anti-immigration push starting on day one is where we begin this hour with some of our favorite experts and reporters and friends. NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff is back. Also joining us, National League Director for the ACLU, Cecilia Wong is here, plus immigration policy expert and Vice President for Immigration Policy and Campaigns at Forward U.S., Andrea Flores is here. Jacob Soboroff, I want to start on family separation because it's where you and I have had the most conversations and where I know your reporting is in a league of its own. Tell me what Trump's actions mean for families and kids who are still separated.
1,000 children, Nicole, as many as 1,000 children today, 6 and 7 years after the implementation of the zero tolerance policy, which deliberately took 5,500 children from their parents for no other reason than to harm them. The cruelty was the point, and the reporting bears that out. It was called government-sanctioned child abuse by the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was called torture by Physicians for Human Rights. It was called one of the most shameful chapters in the history of our country by the Republican-appointed judge that stopped the policy and ordered the reunifications. Those 1,000 children who may still, today as I speak to you, be separated from their parents. The federal government effort that was created under the previous administration, the Biden administration, to track down and reunite those children, which is ongoing, up until yesterday, has been dismantled by President Trump and the Trump administration. They know exactly what it means to dismantle the Family Reunification Task Force. They know exactly what it means for those children and those parents who have gone through this policy that they themselves implemented in 2017 secretly and then 2018, obviously very publicly. And they wanted to send a message clearly by rescinding the executive order creating that task force on day one of this second Trump administration.
Jacob, I want to press you on the why. I mean, there is a lot of support for. If you ask in a poll, are you supportive of deporting people here illegally who commit violent crimes? I think 87% of respondents in a New York Times poll say yes. It's almost the inverse when you ask people if they are supportive of separating very young children from their parents indefinitely. I don't think you get much more than 13% of people saying, yeah, that's a great idea. Why? Why did Trump do this when there's so much support for so many of his other swings?
Because I think that, I don't know what they believe, but what I can tell you is they went out there at the Republican National Convention. I stood there, I reported with you about those signs, mass deportations now. And mass deportations, as we've talked about, are family separation by another name. It's not taking children from their parents at the border. It's separating parents away from their children in the interior, at their school, now as official government policy, potentially in their schools, in their churches, in these sensitive locations that were protected up until the beginning of this administration, but are no longer protected pursuant to orders that have been effectuated by the current Trump administration. And I don't know what they believe, but clearly if they think that mass deportation has the support, they must also believe, or at least take into consideration, that this family separation executive order will also have similar support. But what I can tell you is, having seen it myself on the ground, when people saw family separation, they stood up around the world and they stopped that policy from happening. And when and if mass deportations on a scale larger than Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1954 take place in this country, when the American people see those family separations, the reaction is not going to be to sit on their hands. When there are images of mothers and sons and daughters and fathers being ripped apart from one another in the interior, I can't imagine, as I heard you talking about with John Heilemann yesterday, that those poll numbers don't shift on deportations closer to where they are on family separations.
Andrea, the moment to see what happens may be closer than anyone realizes. I think people who thought they could check out for a while may be in for a harsh surprise. Our colleague Julia Ainsley is reporting that Mr. Holman, who's the gentleman being interviewed in the clip we came in on, has indicated that targeted enforcement operations, that's a quote, are underway, that this work has started. What are you bracing for, and what should the country brace for?
Sure. So right now, when I listen to that Holman interview, I hear a lot of warning and fear mongering to the public. So what I first want to say is that there is no significant change right now to how ICE is conducting its enforcement, but there will be in the coming hours and days. And so it's very important for every single community member who wants to support impacted immigrants that they provide Know Your Rights materials, that mayors and governors really fund and support their legal service providers, and that everyone prepares to be able to determine what's fact and fiction about what's coming. What we saw in yesterday's immigration orders, there were some immediate changes to immigration policy, but there were a lot of very troubling previews that will cause great disruptions in our immigration system, not just for immigrants, but for U.S. citizens. President Trump has declared that there has been an invasion, is unclearly defined, but he's citing the Constitution and saying that anyone who came in under President Biden participated in that invasion. And he uses that across all of the executive orders to justify looking and investigating every single type of immigrant who is in the U.S. It's extremely broad. So what I'm looking for is if President Trump, to your point, responds to what the public wants. And if he starts to exempt whether people who've been here for a long time, immigrants who are dreamers, immigrants who are fleeing conflicts that the United States, supports their refuge here in the United States, is he going to actually abandon Afghan allies who are already vetted and approved? There are many issues in the immigration space that the public actually supports. But what we're seeing is huge backlash to President Biden's administration, which, to be fair, was very damaging on immigration politics because too often President Biden told the American people that what they were witnessing was not a crisis and was not a problem. But if President Trump overcorrects, as we have already seen with some of these executive orders, he will turn the public away further. And I think policymakers have an opportunity, especially in Congress, to be honest brokers and really cut through some of these executive orders and bring the conversation back to Congress.
And